Imagine a queen who spoke more languages than most emperors, who wielded beauty like a weapon, and whose name still commands fascination 2 millennia later. In the grand sweep of history, few figures have managed to capture the collective imagination quite like Cleopatra VII Philopator. For over 2 millennia, her image has been painted, repainted, dramatized, vilified, and glorified, each interpretation layered over the last like sediment obscuring the original bedrock. Modern audiences know her from countless renditions: a cunning seductress, a tragic lover, a manipulative queen, a femme fatale. She has worn many faces in literature and cinema, from Shakespeare's impassioned empress to Elizabeth Taylor's dazzling Hollywood portrayal. These retellings, while rich in drama, have often overshadowed the complexities of the real Cleopatra. A polyglot, a scholar, a ruler caught between two empires, and a woman navigating one of the most volatile political landscapes of the ancient world. Pop culture has, more than anything else, sculpted the image of Cleopatra into an icon of sensuality and excess. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra immortalized her as a tempestuous lover whose passions rivaled her power. Later, films like the 1963 epic Cleopatra reinforced her identity as a glamorous queen, more concerned with romance than governance. Such portrayals, though evocative, have the effect of reducing her to a set of stereotypes that mask her intellectual prowess and political dexterity. These depictions often serve contemporary cultural narratives more than they serve historical truth. Cleopatra's relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were undeniably significant, but to define her legacy solely by her liaisons is to diminish her as a leader and as a historical force in her own right. To understand Cleopatra's legacy, one must first peel back these accumulated layers of myth and legend. We must return to the tumultuous world that shaped her, a world already reeling from centuries of change and conquest, and take a clear-eyed look at her lineage, her cultural inheritance, and the strategic decisions she made to protect her people and her throne. Her story does not begin in isolation. It is rooted in the long and complex history of Egypt and the ruling dynasty that brought her to power. Before Cleopatra ever entered the stage of history, Egypt had already been a grand civilization for thousands of years. From the construction of the pyramids in the Old Kingdom to the conquests of the New Kingdom, the land along the Nile had long served as the heart of a powerful and deeply spiritual culture. However, by the time Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE, Egypt was no longer ruled by native pharaohs. Instead, it had become a Hellenistic kingdom, controlled by the descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, Ptolemy I Soter. Ptolemy was a Macedonian Greek who, after Alexander's death in 323 BCE, seized control of Egypt and declared himself pharaoh. Thus began the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Greek rulers who adopted many Egyptian traditions and titles, but retained a distinctly Hellenic culture. Unlike previous foreign conquerors, the Ptolemies made a concerted effort to legitimize their rule by blending Greek and Egyptian customs. They participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies, built temples to native gods, and even took on traditional pharaonic titles. But despite these efforts, they remained somewhat isolated from the native Egyptian population, ruling as a Greek elite over a largely Egyptian society. This cultural duality defined Cleopatra's world. As a member of the Ptolemaic family, she inherited both the Hellenistic intellectual tradition and the deeply rooted religious authority of the Egyptian pharaohs. What set her apart from many of her predecessors, however, was her willingness to fully embrace the Egyptian identity. Unlike her forebears, Cleopatra learned the Egyptian language, alongside several others including Greek, Latin, and likely Hebrew and Aramaic, making her not only a political leader but a true cultural bridge. Her fluency in Egyptian was not just symbolic, it was a political statement that signaled her dedication to the land she ruled and its people. The Ptolemaic court that Cleopatra was born into was one of immense luxury, opulence, and intrigue. The dynasty was known for its incestuous marriages, complex alliances, and deadly rivalries. Family members regularly vied for the throne, often resorting to assassination or exile. Cleopatra herself would be caught in this web of palace politics from a young age, witnessing firsthand the ruthlessness required to survive and thrive in such an environment. Her father, Ptolemy XII Elites, faced repeated threats to his reign and even spent time in exile. His reliance on Roman support to reclaim and secure his throne foreshadowed the growing influence of Rome in Egyptian affairs, an influence that would come to define Cleopatra's rule. Rome, during Cleopatra's youth, was transforming from a republic into an empire. Its generals and senators, drunk on power and spoils from overseas conquests, increasingly meddled in the affairs of client states like Egypt. Cleopatra's father paid massive bribes to maintain Roman favor, a costly practice that plunged Egypt into debt and sparked domestic unrest. Upon his death in 51 BCE, Cleopatra ascended the throne alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, per Ptolemaic tradition. But the fragile balance of power quickly disintegrated, and within a few years, she found herself ousted from power and forced into exile. What followed was a masterclass in political resilience. Cleopatra's return to power was orchestrated not through brute force, but through strategic alliance, with none other than Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome. Her legendary meeting with Caesar, where she was famously smuggled into the palace rolled in a carpet, was not merely a romantic gesture, but a calculated political maneuver. Cleopatra understood the optics and the stakes. Aligning with Caesar allowed her to reclaim her throne, eliminate her rivals, and stabilize her position. More importantly, it demonstrated her uncanny ability to navigate the treacherous waters of Roman politics while maintaining a vision for Egyptian sovereignty. In the broader context of Hellenistic history, Cleopatra represents both a culmination and a rupture. She was the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and with her death, Egypt ceased to be an independent kingdom, becoming instead a province of the Roman Empire. Yet she was also a pioneer, a ruler who defied expectations and carved out a unique role for herself in a world dominated by men and empires. Her reign, though marked by war and upheaval, also saw advancements in science, the arts, and religious harmony. She patronized scholars, philosophers, and physicians, continuing the intellectual legacy of Alexandria, one of the ancient world's greatest centers of learning. Cleopatra's Egypt was not a crumbling remnant of past glories, but a vibrant, multicultural society at the crossroads of East and West. The temples of Isis still drew worshippers, while the Library of Alexandria, though diminished from its peak, remained a symbol of intellectual achievement. The economy, though burdened by debt and Roman demands, still functioned as a vital artery of trade and agriculture. Cleopatra managed all of this with remarkable dexterity, balancing internal pressures with external threats, all while projecting an image of divine authority and worldly sophistication. It is this complexity that has often been lost in historical and popular narratives. Cleopatra was not simply a pawn in the hands of powerful Roman men. She was a sovereign queen who leveraged every tool at her disposal, diplomacy, intelligence, cultural fluency, and personal charisma, to protect her nation and her legacy. Her choices were shaped by the geopolitical realities of her time, not by whims of romance or vanity. And while her alliances with Caesar and Antony were undoubtedly personal, they were also deeply political, forged in the fires of necessity and ambition. Cleopatra VII Philopator was born in 69 BCE in Alexandria, the thriving capital of Ptolemaic Egypt, a city that was both a hub of Hellenistic culture and the political center of a waning dynasty. Her lineage traced back to Ptolemy Soter, one of Alexander the Great's trusted generals who claimed Egypt as his realm after Alexander's death. Though she was Macedonian Greek by blood, Cleopatra would become the first in her family to truly embrace the Egyptian identity, not just for appearances, but for her own legitimacy as queen. This dual heritage defined her early life, as she was raised in a world of profound cultural synthesis, where the gods of Olympus shared space with the deities of the Nile, and Greek rationalism coexisted with Egyptian mysticism. From an early age, Cleopatra was immersed in a rich educational environment, designed to prepare members of the royal family for governance and diplomacy. Alexandria itself was the center of learning in the ancient world, home to the Great Library and the Museum, institutions that attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean and Near East. Surrounded by thinkers, scientists, and philosophers, Cleopatra's education was both rigorous and eclectic. She was trained in the Greek classics, philosophy, rhetoric, mathematics, and literature, while also learning the intricacies of Egyptian religion and statecraft. Most remarkable was her linguistic ability. Unlike her predecessors, Cleopatra made a concerted effort to learn the Egyptian language, in addition to Greek, Latin, and possibly other languages such as Hebrew, Aramaic, and Ethiopian. Plutarch, writing more than a century after her death, noted that she could speak several languages and rarely needed a translator in diplomatic dealings. This fluency gave her a tremendous advantage as ruler. She could communicate directly with diverse subjects and foreign emissaries, endearing herself to both Egyptian priests and Roman commanders. Cleopatra's early life was shaped as much by danger as by privilege. The Ptolemaic court was a nest of serpents, an environment steeped in paranoia, betrayal, and the ever-present threat of assassination. Succession was rarely smooth in this dynasty. Power was often contested, and rival siblings or even parents could become deadly enemies. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII Elites, faced enormous pressure during his reign, which was marked by instability, Roman intervention, and internal dissent. Known for his extravagant spending and controversial Roman alliances, Ptolemy XII was exiled from Egypt for a period, only to be reinstated with Roman military support. During her formative years, Cleopatra witnessed firsthand the precarious nature of power. Her father's time in exile and subsequent reinstatement taught her about the critical importance of Roman approval and the price it could exact. His reliance on bribes to secure Rome's backing put Egypt in considerable debt and stirred resentment among the populace. Nevertheless, Cleopatra seems to have been a favored child, accompanying her father during his exile and possibly learning the art of diplomacy on Rome's political stage. This exposure would later prove invaluable. Her influences extended beyond her immediate family. The fusion of Greek and Egyptian traditions offered her a wide range of role models. From Egyptian queens like Hatshepsut and Nefertiti, who had wielded substantial power, to Greek heroines in myth and history who challenged traditional gender roles, Cleopatra drew inspiration from both worlds. She was intellectually gifted, politically astute, and ambitious, attributes nurtured from a young age by her complex and challenging environment. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, he left his kingdom to his eldest surviving daughter, Cleopatra, and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was around 10 years old at the time. Following Ptolemaic tradition, the two siblings were to marry and rule jointly. But in practice, the balance of power tipped quickly toward Cleopatra, who was already demonstrating her political acumen. She began appearing alone on official documents and coinage, dropping her brother's name and emphasizing her own authority. This assertiveness, however, soon led to conflict. The court advisors who managed affairs for the young Ptolemy XIII grew wary of Cleopatra's independence and influence. Within 2 years, she was stripped of power and forced to flee Alexandria, retreating to the eastern Egyptian desert to mount a resistance. It was during this period of exile that she displayed her flair for political theater and strategic thinking, qualities that would define her reign. In 48 BCE, Cleopatra saw an opportunity for a dramatic return to power. Julius Caesar, Rome's most powerful general, had arrived in Alexandria in pursuit of his rival Pompey, who had sought refuge in Egypt. Pompey was murdered by Ptolemy XII's advisors in an attempt to gain Caesar's favor, but the act only disgusted Caesar, who was both politically and personally outraged. Cleopatra, ever calculating, seized on the moment to present herself as the rightful and more legitimate ruler. The story of her re-entry into Caesar's presence is legendary. Rolled up in a rug or bedding and smuggled into the royal palace where Caesar was staying. The gesture was bold, theatrical, and effective. Caesar was captivated, not just by Cleopatra's beauty as later myths would claim, but by her intelligence, wit, and ambition. Their political goals aligned. She needed Roman support to reclaim her throne, and he needed a stable Egypt, a vital supplier of grain, under a cooperative ruler. Their alliance triggered the Alexandrian War, a brutal civil conflict that pitted Cleopatra and Caesar against Ptolemy XIII and his supporters. The city of Alexandria became a battlefield, its streets and harbors filled with Roman legions, Egyptian soldiers, and the chaos of civil strife. Caesar's forces eventually prevailed, and Ptolemy XIII drowned while attempting to flee across the Nile. With her brother dead, Cleopatra was reinstated as ruler, this time alongside another younger sibling, Ptolemy XIV, whom she also nominally married. Cleopatra's position was now secure, but she understood the fragility of power and the need for strong foundations. Her initial reforms as queen focused on stabilizing the economy, strengthening Egypt's political alliances, and reasserting royal authority. She enacted policies to relieve tax burdens on the poor, stabilize the currency, and worked to ease the tensions between the Greek and Egyptian elements of her population. She also began to rebuild the prestige of the royal house, commissioning statues, temples, and coins that emphasized her divine status and cultural legitimacy. Her relationship with Caesar deepened during this period, both politically and personally. He remained in Egypt for several months after the war, and Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Caesarion Ptolemy 15, whom she declared to be Caesar's heir. Though Caesar never officially acknowledged the child in Roman political forums, he treated Cleopatra with respect and hosted her in Rome in 46 BCE, where her presence caused both fascination and controversy. To many Romans, she was a foreign queen and an uncomfortable symbol of the shifting power dynamics within the Republic. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra ruled as a sovereign monarch. Though she maintained the fiction of co-ruling with Ptolemy 14, he was clearly subordinate. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra quickly moved to eliminate potential threats to her rule, including Ptolemy 14, who died under suspicious circumstances, possibly poisoned. She then elevated Caesarion as her co-regent, proclaiming him the rightful son of Caesar and therefore the legitimate heir to both Egyptian and Roman legacies. This bold claim placed her at odds with the shifting power structure in Rome. After Caesar's death, the Roman Republic descended into chaos once more, with factions aligning behind different leaders. Brutus and Cassius on one side, Mark Antony and Octavian on the other. Cleopatra watched these developments closely, understanding that Egypt's survival depended on strategic alignment with the winning side. In the years following her return to the throne, Cleopatra demonstrated remarkable diplomatic finesse. She maintained Egypt's independence while navigating the volatile world of Roman politics. Her court in Alexandria became a sophisticated cultural and political center, a place where Roman, Greek, and Egyptian traditions mingled under the patronage of one of antiquity's most formidable women. She secured Egypt's borders, preserved its economic base, and fostered a sense of unity within her diverse population. Throughout this period, she also worked to elevate her image, both domestically and abroad. She cultivated the persona of Isis incarnate, aligning herself with the Egyptian goddess of motherhood, fertility, and kingship. This alignment served dual purposes. It reinforced her status among Egyptian subjects who revered Isis, and it emphasized her role as a divine and stabilizing force in a world increasingly dominated by war and uncertainty. By the time she encountered Mark Antony, Cleopatra was no longer merely a queen entangled in Roman affairs. She was a seasoned ruler, the embodiment of a centuries-old civilization, and a woman with a clear sense of her destiny. Her early life, marked by exile, rivalry, and learning, had prepared her for the monumental challenges ahead. Her rise to power was not just the result of charm or romantic intrigue, but the culmination of years of strategic positioning, intellectual cultivation, and political courage. In reclaiming her throne and securing Egypt's sovereignty, Cleopatra proved herself not just as a survivor, but as a sovereign, one whose legacy would continue to shape the imagination of the world long after her kingdom fell. When Cleopatra first met Julius Caesar in 48 BCE, it was not merely a moment of romantic intrigue, but a political turning point in ancient history. At that time, Egypt was deeply embroiled in a civil war between Cleopatra and her brother-husband Ptolemy 13. The rivalry had led Cleopatra into exile, while Ptolemy's regents tightened their grip on Alexandria. Meanwhile, Caesar, fresh from pursuing his political enemy Pompey across the Mediterranean, had landed in Egypt expecting a brief stay. But he found himself pulled into Egypt's dynastic conflicts. Pompey had already been assassinated by Ptolemy's court in a failed bid to curry favor with Caesar. This cold-blooded murder only offended the Roman general, leaving him distrustful of Egypt's ruling elite. Cleopatra understood that her only hope of reclaiming her throne lay in Roman support. But to reach Caesar, she needed to bypass her brother's forces and the cautious advisors who guarded Caesar closely. Legend has it she was smuggled into Caesar's chambers wrapped in a rug or a linen sack, an entrance designed to astonish and disarm. Whether or not the dramatic imagery is literally true, the effect was undeniably theatrical. Cleopatra presented herself not as a desperate exile, but as a charismatic, intelligent, and formidable political partner. Caesar, ever attuned to power dynamics and showmanship, was captivated. Their alliance quickly formed. While the exact nature of their early relationship, romantic, strategic, or both, remains debated, what's certain is that Cleopatra and Caesar saw mutual advantage in one another. Cleopatra needed military strength to defeat her brother and reclaim her throne, while Caesar, seeking to restore order in Egypt and secure the grain supply crucial to Rome, found in Cleopatra a capable and loyal ally. The Alexandrian War soon followed. Caesar's relatively small Roman contingent became embroiled in fierce fighting with Ptolemy Xi's forces. Despite being outnumbered and unfamiliar with the terrain, Caesar's military acumen and reinforcements turned the tide. Cleopatra's political insight also played a key role. She knew the terrain, the alliances, and the weaknesses of her enemies. In 47 BCE, Ptolemy XIII was killed, reportedly drowning while trying to flee across the Nile, and Cleopatra was reinstated as queen. To maintain the illusion of dynastic continuity, she married her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, but held the real power herself. Her personal bond with Caesar deepened during this period. He remained in Egypt for several months, longer than many Roman citizens thought appropriate. Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Ptolemy XV Philopator Philometor Caesar, known as Caesarion or Little Caesar. Though Caesar never officially named Caesarion as his heir in Roman records, Cleopatra firmly declared the child as Caesar's legitimate son. This announcement sent tremors through Roman politics. If Caesarion were truly Caesar's heir, he could challenge Roman succession, destabilize power structures, and potentially reshape the political world with Egypt at its center. Cleopatra's sojourn in Rome in 46 to 44 BCE further fanned these flames. Caesar, now dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, hosted Cleopatra in a villa across the Tiber River. Though she never held an official position in Roman political life, her presence was deeply symbolic. She was not just a guest, but a sovereign, a mother of Caesar's child, and a queen of a kingdom vital to Roman interests. Her appearance, often in Egyptian garb and style, unsettled the Roman elite. Many viewed her as a threat, an embodiment of Eastern excess and foreign influence at the heart of Roman affairs. Roman reaction to Cleopatra's presence was mixed. The populace was fascinated, the Senate was uneasy, and Caesar's enemies saw a useful narrative. Cleopatra became a symbol of Caesar's ambitions to become a king, an image Rome rejected. The tension culminated in 44 BCE, with Caesar's assassination on the Ides of March. Cleopatra was in Rome when it happened. With Caesar dead, her position became perilous. Lacking allies, she quietly returned to Egypt with Caesarion. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra moved swiftly to secure her rule. Ptolemy XIV, her co-ruler and brother, soon died, likely poisoned, leaving Caesarion as her official co-regent. In claiming Caesar's legacy for her son, Cleopatra hoped to preserve Egypt's autonomy and strengthen its influence. But Rome was entering yet another power struggle, this time between the assassins of Caesar, Brutus and Cassius, and his loyalists, particularly Mark Antony and Octavian. Cleopatra remained cautious in the immediate aftermath, avoiding entanglements in Roman civil wars while maintaining her kingdom's stability. But in 41 BCE, a new opportunity and a new alliance emerged. Mark Antony, now a triumvir and one of the most powerful men in the Roman world, summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in Cilicia. He needed resources for his upcoming campaign against Parthia and sought Cleopatra's financial support. Cleopatra, ever shrewd, recognized another moment of high-stakes diplomacy. Her arrival in Tarsus was orchestrated with theatrical brilliance. She sailed up the river Cydnus on a gilded barge, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, surrounded by attendants dressed as cupids and nymphs. Perfumes wafted through the air, music played, and Antony, despite his reputation as a hardened general, was dazzled. As with Caesar, Cleopatra used performance and charisma to frame herself as not only a queen, but a living deity, a symbol of Eastern opulence and mystique. Antony, steeped in the mythology of Alexander and his Eastern conquests, found in Cleopatra a partner who embodied the glory of a dream that merged East and West. Their relationship quickly turned from diplomatic to romantic. Cleopatra returned to Alexandria with Antony, and for a time, their union flourished in a city that pulsed with luxury, learning, and ambition. Antony wintered in Alexandria, indulging in a lifestyle that Roman critics would later paint as debauched and effeminate. But beyond the rumors of excess, their alliance had a deeply strategic foundation. Cleopatra offered Antony money, troops, and a base of power outside of Rome. Antony offered Cleopatra Roman protection and potential influence over imperial politics. Their political partnership took on a grand vision. In 34 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra held the donations of Alexandria, a ceremonial display of power in which territories in the east were granted to Cleopatra and her children. Caesarion was declared King of Kings, and Cleopatra was titled Queen of Kings. Cleopatra and Antony imagined a new global order with Alexandria, not Rome, at its center. This vision challenged the supremacy of the Roman state and directly threatened Octavian, who had by then consolidated his position in Rome. The donations outraged the Roman elite. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and political heir, seized the moment to attack Antony's legitimacy. He circulated Antony's will, which, allegedly, included instructions to be buried in Alexandria and left his wealth to Cleopatra's children. This document, perhaps authentic, perhaps forged or edited, was political dynamite. To the Roman people, it painted Antony as a traitor who had forsaken Roman values, sovereignty, and tradition for an Egyptian queen and her Eastern ambitions. Meanwhile, Cleopatra and Antony continued their rule in Alexandria. Their court was resplendent, infused with Greek, Egyptian, and Roman elements. Scholars, poets, generals, and administrators filled the palace. Cleopatra maintained tight control over Egyptian administration, continuing her economic and religious policies to strengthen internal unity. Together, she and Antony styled themselves not merely as rulers, but as living gods, embodiments of Dionysus and Isis, symbols of divine order and prosperity. But war with Rome was inevitable. In 32 BCE, Octavian declared war, not on Antony but on Cleopatra. This clever move framed the conflict as one between Rome and a foreign queen, avoiding the optics of civil war and painting Cleopatra as the root of Antony's betrayal. The final clash came in 31 BCE at the Battle of Actium, a naval engagement off the western coast of Greece. Cleopatra commanded part of the fleet herself, an extraordinary feat for any ruler, let alone a woman in antiquity. The battle ended disastrously for her and Antony. Their fleet was overwhelmed, and Cleopatra fled the scene with her ships, followed by Antony. They returned to Alexandria to prepare for the inevitable Roman invasion. Their last months were marked by uncertainty, despair, and defiance. Cleopatra attempted to negotiate with Octavian, even offering Caesarion as a potential co-ruler of Egypt under Roman suzerainty. But Octavian rejected all overtures. He had no interest in compromise. He wanted Egypt, and the myth of Cleopatra, utterly destroyed. In 30 BCE, Roman forces entered Alexandria. Antony, believing Cleopatra dead, committed suicide. Cleopatra, upon learning of his death and realizing that her own fate was sealed, chose to die on her own terms rather than be paraded as a trophy in Octavian's triumph. The manner of her death remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. Some sources claim she used a poisonous ASP, others that she applied a lethal ointment. What's certain is that she died with deliberate intent, preserving her dignity and denying her enemies the spectacle of her humiliation. With Cleopatra's death, Egypt was annexed as a Roman province. Caesarion was captured and executed on Octavian's orders, ensuring that no rival heir to Caesar remained. Thus ended the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Hellenistic age. Cleopatra was the last pharaoh, the final sovereign ruler of an independent Egypt. Yet her story did not end with her death. The myth of Cleopatra grew exponentially in the Roman imagination. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, encouraged the portrayal of Cleopatra as a dangerous seductress, a foreign temptress who bewitched Roman heroes and nearly brought the empire to ruin. Poets, historians, and propagandists shaped her image to suit their needs. She became a symbol, a scapegoat, and eventually a legend. What is often forgotten in this mythologizing is the reality of Cleopatra's life. A woman who ruled for 2 decades with intelligence, cultural acumen, and political vision. She navigated the treacherous waters of 2 empires, aligned herself with the most powerful men of her age not just out of romance, but out of necessity and ambition. She sought to preserve her kingdom, elevate her dynasty, and assert Egypt's place in a rapidly changing world. Her alliances with Caesar and Antony were not mere affairs of the heart. They were partnerships forged in the crucible of survival, shaped by shared interests and imperial dreams. Cleopatra dared to imagine a different world order, one where East and West could merge, not under the dominance of Rome, but through a synthesis of civilizations. For that dream, she fought, ruled, and died. And in doing so, she became immortal, not just in myth but in the memory of history. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE marked not only the downfall of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, but also the decisive moment when the Roman Republic gave way to imperial dominance under Octavian. It was a naval confrontation on a massive scale, with political, psychological, and mythological dimensions that would echo for centuries. For Cleopatra, the battle was the culmination of her ambitions to preserve Egypt's sovereignty and redefine the world order through an alliance with Antony. For Octavian, it was the final contest for control over Rome and its vast territories, and he intended to win it not just by force, but through manipulation of perception and narrative. Leading up to the battle, Cleopatra and Antony fortified themselves in Greece with a vast fleet and legions of troops. Though Antony had the superior naval force on paper, an armada composed of large, heavily armed ships, he and Cleopatra found themselves increasingly isolated. Many of Antony's allies defected, and Octavian's general, Agrippa, effectively cut off Antony's supply lines and outmaneuvered his forces with smaller, faster ships. Cleopatra, commanding her own squadron, brought Egypt's military resources to the alliance, but by this point morale was faltering. More than just a confrontation of ships and strategy, Actium was a psychological war. Octavian's masterstroke was his calculated use of propaganda. He depicted Antony as having fallen under the spell of a foreign queen, seduced by Eastern decadence, and turned against the values of Roman discipline and patriotism. Cleopatra became the centerpiece of this narrative. A witch, a temptress, a figure of exotic corruption who had bewitched one of Rome's own and was plotting the conquest of the Republic. This psychological campaign began long before the first oars struck the water. Octavian had Antony's supposed will read publicly in the Senate, a will in which Antony allegedly declared his desire to be buried in Alexandria and bestowed lands upon Cleopatra's children. Whether authentic or strategically edited, this document caused a scandal in Rome. It confirmed the fears Octavian had stoked. Antony was no longer loyal to Rome, but to a foreign dynasty. This rhetorical maneuver allowed Octavian to declare war not on Antony, his rival, but on Cleopatra, a foreign enemy, which was far more palatable to Roman sensibilities. As the two forces faced off at Actium, tensions within Antony and Cleopatra's camp were high. Some of Antony's most trusted generals had already defected, others hesitated. On the Roman side, Agrippa launched swift and efficient attacks, harassing Antony's fleet and forcing a showdown. Cleopatra, stationed with a reserve fleet, waited for the signal to engage. But when the battle turned against them, she made the controversial decision to retreat with her ships. Seeing this, Antony broke formation and followed her, abandoning his fleet and leaving it vulnerable to Octavian's forces. This act, whether premeditated or spontaneous, has been interpreted both as a calculated retreat and as a moment of despair-driven impulse. The retreat to Alexandria did not mean surrender. For nearly a year after the battle, Cleopatra and Antony regrouped, prepared for the final confrontation. They fortified the city, reached out diplomatically to Rome, and made last-ditch efforts to rally support. Cleopatra attempted to negotiate directly with Octavian, offering her crown, wealth, and even her son Caesarion's future in exchange for Egypt's safety. Octavian, however, had already decided Cleopatra would not live to become a symbol or a rival again. Inside Alexandria, the mood darkened. Antony, isolated and increasingly depressed, received false reports that Cleopatra had died. Grief-stricken, he attempted suicide by falling on his sword. He survived the wound and was carried to Cleopatra's hidden chamber, where he reportedly died in her arms. A final, tragic moment that added a poetic ending to their saga. Cleopatra, now truly alone, faced the inevitable. With Octavian's forces entering the city, she retreated to her mausoleum, taking with her the last of her treasures and final followers. Cleopatra's death remains one of history's most enduring enigmas. Ancient sources differ on the method. The most popular version, made famous by Roman historians and later dramatists, is that she arranged for a poisonous asp, a symbol of divine royalty, to bite her, a death steeped in Egyptian mysticism and Roman theater. Other accounts suggest poison concealed in a hairpin or ointment. Whatever the method, Cleopatra's final act was deliberate. She chose death over humiliation, knowing Octavian would likely parade her in a Roman triumph. With her death in 30 BCE, Egypt fell completely into Roman hands, marking the end of both the Ptolemaic dynasty and millennia of pharaonic rule. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar, was briefly proclaimed pharaoh but was swiftly executed by Octavian's men. With his death, the bloodline of the Ptolemies was extinguished. Egypt, once a center of power, religion, and culture, was now a Roman province, ruled by governors sent from the capital. Octavian's triumph was total. Not only had he secured Egypt's immense wealth and strategic grain supplies, but he had also eliminated his last significant rival. A year later, he would become Augustus, Rome's first emperor. But Cleopatra's legacy did not die with her. Instead, it was reshaped, distorted, and weaponized. Octavian knew that victory on the battlefield was not enough. He needed to control the narrative. Cleopatra, dead and voiceless, was turned into a villain, a symbol of everything Rome rejected and feared. Octavian's propaganda portrayed her as a decadent, scheming queen whose seductive power had almost brought down the Republic. This portrayal was amplified in Roman literature, particularly in the works of poets like Virgil, Horace, and Propertius. In the Aeneid, Cleopatra is thinly veiled as a personification of Eastern chaos, set in opposition to Roman order and virtue. Horace described her as a crazy queen, drunk with power. The Eastern queen became a foil to Octavian's disciplined Roman ideal. She was used to explain Antony's downfall, not as the result of Octavian's cunning or Rome's politics, but as the tragic seduction of a once great Roman by a dangerous woman. Roman art reinforced this image. Cleopatra was rarely depicted with dignity. Instead, she was shown in exoticized garb, with exaggerated features and in scenes of drunkenness or sensuality. The asp, whether real or metaphorical, became her eternal symbol, conflating her death with animalistic instinct and dark sorcery. Her role as a mother, a reformer, and a ruler was almost completely erased. The vilification of Cleopatra served a broader political purpose. It justified Roman imperialism. Her alleged excess, cruelty, and tyranny became evidence of why Eastern monarchies needed to be subdued and civilized by Rome. Her court's wealth and sophistication were reframed as signs of corruption and decadence. By conquering her, Octavian framed himself not just as a victorious general, but as the savior of Rome from foreign subjugation. The moral tale was clear. Rome's discipline had triumphed over Eastern luxury. Over time, this image calcified into stereotype. Medieval and Renaissance scholars, relying on Roman sources, inherited a Cleopatra who was more myth than woman. Shakespeare, whose portrayal in Antony and Cleopatra shaped centuries of Western understanding, presented her as passionate, irrational, and dangerously irresistible. Though his depiction was more sympathetic than earlier ones, it still leaned heavily on the tropes established by Rome. The real Cleopatra, intelligent, multilingual, politically astute, and deeply invested in Egypt's welfare, was buried beneath layers of narrative. Her reign, marked by economic reform, religious renewal, and diplomatic cunning, was reduced to a love story and a fall from grace. Her children were erased from history. Her policies were ignored. Her cultural synthesis of Hellenistic and Egyptian traditions was forgotten. Even in modern times, Cleopatra's image remains contested. She has been reinvented countless times, as a femme fatale, a feminist icon, a nationalist heroine. Each age finds in her a mirror for its own anxieties and aspirations. Yet the Roman myth endures, not because it is accurate, but because it was brilliantly executed. Octavian's propaganda machine created a villainess who served Rome's narrative needs, and in doing so, obscured one of the most remarkable figures in history. Cleopatra's story is ultimately not just a tale of personal tragedy or political ambition. It is a lesson in how history is written by victors. Her transformation from sovereign to siren, from ruler to ruin, reveals more about Rome than about Egypt. It exposes how empires manufacture their enemies in order to justify conquest, and how women in power are often recast as threats rather than leaders. Today, as scholars re-examine ancient texts and archaeological evidence, a new Cleopatra emerges. One who ruled wisely in a world hostile to powerful women, who loved strategically in a landscape of empire, and who died not as a victim, but as a sovereign who chose her own end. Her legacy, far from being one of mere seduction and scandal, is one of resilience, intellect, and enduring cultural influence. And in rediscovering the woman behind the myth, we also challenge the narratives that history has long taken for granted. After Cleopatra's death and the fall of Alexandria, Egypt underwent a profound transformation, not only in political structure, but also in cultural identity. For the native Egyptian population, Cleopatra's reign represented something more than the end of a dynasty. It was the severing of a world shaped by pharaonic grandeur and localized spiritual continuity. And yet, her memory did not vanish with Roman conquest. Within the Nile Valley, among temple ruins and the quiet inscriptions carved into stone, Cleopatra endured, not merely as a ruler, but as a figure of reverence, complexity, and sometimes contradiction. To the Egyptians, Cleopatra was not just a queen. She was also a pharaoh, and her reign, though dominated by Greek customs due to her Ptolemaic heritage, integrated traditional Egyptian religious symbolism. She was depicted on temple walls offering to the gods in native regalia, in full pharaonic dress, headdress, kilt, and uraeus serpent, all signs of divine kingship. Unlike some of her Ptolemaic predecessors, Cleopatra took care to adopt Egyptian religious rituals and to speak to the native population not as an outsider, but as a legitimate successor of ancient traditions. Hieroglyphic inscriptions found in temples such as Dendera and Edfu still depict her participating in ritual activities, offering gifts to deities like Hathor and Isis, aligning herself with the eternal values of Ma'at, order, justice, harmony. At Dendera, for instance, she is represented alongside her son Caesarion, the pair presented as divine rulers blessed by the gods. These inscriptions suggest a strong religious presence, one that connected Cleopatra deeply to the cultural psyche of the native Egyptian priesthood and population. Coinage from her reign further reveals how she straddled identities. On the one hand, her coins bore her Greek image, prominent nose, strong chin, and regal bearing, often depicted alongside Greek inscriptions. But in temples and on local stelae, she was the living embodiment of Isis, the mother goddess, protector of Egypt, and symbol of regeneration. In this way, Cleopatra transcended the foreignness of her Macedonian lineage. To the rural communities and priestly orders of Egypt, she wasn't merely a Greek queen. She was the living Horus in female form, a divine intermediary between people and gods. Yet, despite these efforts, there remained a tension. Cleopatra's upbringing was fundamentally Greek, her court and education dominated by Hellenistic values. The Egyptian population may have admired her public adoption of traditional rituals, but some also may have viewed her as part of the foreign ruling elite who had governed Egypt since Alexander the Great's conquest. The extent to which the common people mourned her loss remains a mystery. Most written records from the period that survive are Roman, and the Egyptian voices are filtered through layers of interpretation. Still, there are no known riots or large-scale uprisings following her death, which might suggest that her rule, while religiously legitimate, did not ignite mass nationalist sentiment. Over time, Cleopatra's memory in Egypt faded not through rejection, but through subtle erasure. With Egypt absorbed into the Roman system, the old gods and temple systems began to decline. Priests lost their political influence. The temples fell silent. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, the ancient stories became myths, and the pharaoh's images were covered or defaced. Cleopatra, the last to claim the mantle of Egypt's god-kings, became a historical whisper in her own land. It would take centuries and the pens of foreign chroniclers for her name to resurface, this time in entirely different forms. In the medieval Islamic world, Cleopatra's legacy took on a new and fascinating shape. As Arab scholars began to absorb and reinterpret the classical knowledge of Greece and Rome, Cleopatra emerged not merely as a queen, but as a figure of scientific and intellectual brilliance. Unlike her vilification in Roman texts, Islamic writers often portrayed her as a philosopher, alchemist, and sage. Her image, far from being reduced to romantic scandal or imperial downfall, was elevated in intellectual circles as one of wisdom and esoteric knowledge. Arabic historians such as al-Masudi and Ibn al-Kifti included Cleopatra in their historical works not as a seductress, but as a sovereign deeply versed in the sciences of her time. She was said to have built monuments, constructed elaborate engineering systems, and delved into the hidden sciences of astrology and alchemy. In some texts, she was referred to as Balkis or Cleopatra, a variation that indicated both cultural transformation and reverence. One of the most notable appearances of Cleopatra in Islamic literature is in the Kitab al-Hikmah al-Kadima, the Book of Ancient Wisdom, where she is identified as a philosopher queen whose reign was marked by intellectual flourishing. Stories attributed to her include her designing protective talismans, commissioning the construction of great edifices, and developing medical knowledge that would later be transmitted to Europe via Islamic scholars. What stands out in these narratives is the disconnect from her romantic entanglements. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony were largely omitted or downplayed. What mattered was her contribution to knowledge and the mystique of her court as a center of learning. In this light, Cleopatra was absorbed into the Islamic cultural imagination as a wise woman, one who communicated with spirits, understood the properties of metals, and ruled justly. Her gender, while notable, was less of a hindrance in these stories than it had been in Roman literature. Rather, she stood as an exception to male-dominated rule, not because of her seduction, but because of her intellectual prowess. There were still contradictions. Some Islamic accounts framed her within moralistic tales, warning of the corruption of power or the illusions of earthly wisdom. Yet the dominant motif was admiration, not condemnation. The memory of Cleopatra in Islamic texts often aligned more with the idea of a legendary sovereign from the ancient past, akin to figures like Solomon or the Queen of Sheba, than with the degraded image constructed by Octavian's Rome. What is fascinating about this reinterpretation is the cultural gap it reveals. While Western Europe inherited Cleopatra through the lens of Roman imperial propaganda, deeply influenced by Shakespearean drama and medieval Christian morality, the Islamic world reimagined her through the values of scholarship and metaphysical exploration. It's a striking example of how a single historical figure can wear entirely different faces, depending on the lenses through which she is seen. As Europe entered the Renaissance, those lenses began to shift once again. With the revival of classical learning, European scholars rediscovered the writings of Plutarch, Dio Cassius, and other ancient historians who had recorded Cleopatra's story. She re-emerged as both a historical curiosity and a subject for artistic representation. In paintings, poetry, and eventually the stage, Cleopatra became a canvas onto which the complexities of gender, power, and morality were projected. Perhaps the most defining moment of her Renaissance reawakening came with Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, written around 1606. Here, Cleopatra was neither mere villainess nor perfect heroine. She was a figure of towering emotion, contradiction, and pathos. Shakespeare's Cleopatra was passionate, witty, volatile, and ultimately tragic. Her relationship with Antony was depicted as a cosmic romance, a collision of love and duty that led to inevitable ruin. This portrayal captivated audiences and helped to cement Cleopatra's place in Western imagination not as a distant queen, but as a deeply human protagonist. The Renaissance image of Cleopatra was layered. On one hand, she was the embodiment of the femme fatale, a trope that fascinated and disturbed patriarchal societies. Her sexuality was dangerous, her ambition threatening. Yet on the other hand, she was seen as a romantic ideal, a woman who defied empires for love, who refused subjugation, and who met death on her own terms. Artists painted her dying nobly, often with the asp coiled at her breast, a symbol of both beauty and fatal allure. During the Enlightenment, these interpretations deepened and diversified. Cleopatra became the subject of scholarly debate and philosophical reflection. Some thinkers saw her as a cautionary tale about excess and passion, linking her downfall to her inability to restrain emotion with reason. Others viewed her as a political actor caught in the clash of empires, using the tools available to her, intellect, charm, alliance, to safeguard her kingdom. Voltaire and other Enlightenment figures occasionally referenced Cleopatra as part of their broader critiques of monarchy and despotism. In contrast, feminist thinkers and writers in the later 18th and 19th centuries began to reclaim her legacy, questioning the biases of ancient male historians and emphasizing her agency. Cleopatra was increasingly seen as a woman constrained not by her own limitations, but by the political forces that sought to diminish her. Art and literature reflected these evolving attitudes. In neoclassical paintings, she was often portrayed in dramatic scenes, receiving Antony, facing Octavian, or preparing for death, each moment an opportunity to explore the emotional and political depths of her story. In opera, she became a tragic soprano, her voice ringing out in arias of betrayal and resolve. Across all these representations, one thing remained constant. Cleopatra was never allowed to be ordinary. Whether cast as villain, victim, philosopher, or lover, she was always exceptional. Her image served as a mirror to each era's ideals and anxieties, about power, empire, gender, and fate. Thus, from the Nile Valley temples to the manuscripts of Baghdad, and from Shakespeare's stage to the salons of Enlightenment Europe, Cleopatra endured. She was not just a historical figure but a symbol, ever shifting, ever debated, and ever compelling. Her story, shaped by victors and visionaries alike, reminds us not only of the fragility of power, but of the endurance of myth. And in tracing her legacy across cultures and centuries, we uncover not just the truth of a queen, but the truths that civilizations tell themselves about those who rise, fall, and refuse to be forgotten. From the shimmering saga of Hollywood's golden age to the desert sands still yielding fragments of her past, Cleopatra's presence has permeated the modern imagination in ways that few ancient figures ever have. In 1963, The world watched as Elizabeth Taylor, draped in extravagant jewels and stoic regal bearing, brought Cleopatra to life in a film that became as much legend for its behind-the-scenes dramas as for its on-screen drama. Production delays, spiraling budgets, and Taylor's own tempestuous romance with co-star Richard Burton turned the making of the movie into a spectacle rivaling the story it depicted. Yet, when audiences finally beheld Taylor's Cleopatra, suave, seductive, and imperious, they encountered a version of the queen that was as much a reflection of mid-20th century ideals of beauty and femininity as it was an echo of the ancient monarch. Taylor's Cleopatra was glamorous and commanding, yet undeniably tragic, embodying the tensions between power and vulnerability that continue to fascinate modern viewers. The film's lavish costumes and sets set a high-water mark for historical epics, cementing Cleopatra's status as a cultural icon whose allure could transcend millennia. In the decades since Taylor's portrayals, feminist scholars and artists have reclaimed Cleopatra not merely as an object of male desire or a tragic figure undone by romance, but as a formidable ruler who exercised agency in a world dominated by men. Rather than viewing her relationships with Caesar and Antony as evidence of her subservience, contemporary reinterpretations often highlight her diplomatic acumen and statecraft. Feminist biographers emphasize that Cleopatra spoke multiple languages, navigated court intrigues with skill, and enacted economic reforms to stabilize Egypt's finances, actions that speak to her intellectual heft and political savvy. In these retellings, her beauty and charm become components of a broader toolkit she wielded to forge alliances and protect her kingdom, not distractions from her leadership. Artists from playwrights to graphic novelists have reimagined Cleopatra as a paragon of female sovereignty, portraying her as a strategic thinker whose decisions were driven by pragmatic goals rather than mere passion. This shift has allowed modern audiences to see her as a queen in her own right, whose power stemmed from intellect and authority as much as from allure. Cleopatra's influence extends far beyond film and academic treatises. Novelists have penned historical fiction that places her at the center of sweeping narratives, while poets have meditated on her mysteries, using her as a muse for explorations of love, loss, and empire. In music, from classical compositions to contemporary songs, her name evokes opulence, intrigue, and the weight of history. Pop artists have sampled her image, often as a symbol of formidable femininity and exotic mystique, fueling debates about cultural appropriation and the ethics of representing an ancient Egyptian ruler through the lens of modern aesthetics. Graphic designers incorporate her iconography, snake headdresses, stylized eyes, Ankh symbols, into fashion lines and branding, perpetuating an aesthetic shorthand that simultaneously celebrates and simplifies her legacy. Even video games and virtual reality experiences invite players to assume her role, navigating ancient Egypt as Cleopatra to engage with her political and cultural world. Each new medium reinvents her, ensuring that Cleopatra remains a living presence in global popular culture. Yet with this continuing fascination come thorny questions of race and representation. Cleopatra was a Ptolemaic ruler of Macedonian Greek descent who embraced Egyptian culture. But modern portrayals have sometimes skewed her ethnic identity to align with contemporary agendas or prejudices. Hollywood and Western art have often depicted her with distinctly European features, minimizing her Egyptian context and reinforcing a Eurocentric narrative. In recent years, activists and scholars have challenged such portrayals, calling for more historically grounded depictions that reflect the multi-ethnic milieu of Hellenistic Egypt. Debates flare over casting choices, whether Cleopatra should be portrayed by actors of North African or Middle Eastern descent, or by those who exemplify Western beauty standards. These controversies underscore larger conversations about who has the authority to tell ancient stories and how modern biases shape our understanding of the past. By grappling with these issues, contemporary discourse around Cleopatra also becomes an avenue for examining systemic inequities in media representation and the politics of identity. While the screens and pages of modern culture keep Cleopatra's legend alive, archaeology strives to recover the tangible remnants of her reign, and perhaps even the queen herself. For centuries her tomb was thought lost forever, its location obscured by the silting of the Nile Delta and the transformations of the Alexandrian landscape. In recent decades, the temple complex at Taposiris Magna, about 40 miles west of Alexandria, has emerged as a prime candidate for her burial site. Excavations have uncovered coins bearing Cleopatra's visage, inscriptions that reference rituals dedicated to the queen as goddess, and statuettes that hint at a cultic following. The discovery of a carved coiffure resembling her distinctive hairstyle further fueled hopes. Yet, despite tantalizing finds, no definitive sarcophagus or body has been located. Alternative theories propose sites in central Alexandria or along the Nile's ancient course, but each hypothesis faces the challenges of urban development, rising groundwater levels, and limited funding for large-scale digs. Recent archaeological work has also produced fascinating insights into Cleopatra's world, even if her final resting place remains elusive. Studies of shipwrecks off the coast of Alexandria reveal the grandeur of Ptolemaic naval technology, massive war galleys and ornate pleasure barges that once conveyed the queen in triumphal processions. Temple excavations have shed light on her religious patronage, unearthing inscriptions that document restorations of sanctuaries dedicated to Isis and Serapis, and altars that illustrate her role as mediator between deities and mortals. These discoveries reinforce the image of Cleopatra as a hands-on sovereign who invested in religious and civic projects to reinforce her legitimacy. However, Egyptologists debate how much of these structures date to her reign versus those of predecessors or successors. The fragmentary record allows for multiple interpretations. Was she the prime mover of these constructions, or a figurehead over long-standing traditions? Such debates highlight the complexities of attributing ancient works to specific rulers in a landscape where layers of history overlap. Despite the impressive progress of fieldwork, Cleopatra's physical legacy remains stubbornly invisible. No temple precinct exclusively dedicated to her has been found. No palace suites identifiable as her private chambers have come to light. Some scholars attribute this to the systematic repurposing of building materials in Roman and Arab rule. Stones from royal monuments were often quarried for new construction. Others point to the deliberate erasure of Ptolemaic symbols after Egypt's integration into the Roman Empire, when the new regime sought to suppress reminders of the old dynasty. Natural processes, coastal erosion, earthquakes, shifting sand, have also claimed much of ancient Alexandria. Thus, much of what Cleopatra built or commissioned may lie underwater or buried beneath modern neighborhoods, waiting for the right combination of technology, funding, and scholarly determination to rediscover it. Beyond bricks and statues, Cleopatra's enduring contribution may lie in the intellectual and political frameworks she fostered during her two-decade reign. She was a notable patron of scholars, physicians, and artists who congregated in Alexandria, the intellectual hub of the Mediterranean world. Under her sponsorship, the Library of Alexandria, though diminished from its Hellenistic apex, continued to attract researchers who pursued geometry, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Papyri from her era record medical prescriptions that blend Egyptian herbal traditions with Greek natural philosophy, suggesting her court supported cross-cultural scientific inquiry. Astronomical observations made during her reign contributed to the calendrical systems that governed agricultural and religious festivals in Egypt. By funding these endeavors, Cleopatra positioned her kingdom as a beacon of learning even as Rome's power eclipsed Hellenistic states. Administrative reforms under Cleopatra likewise left an indelible mark on Egypt's governance. When she ascended the throne, her country was burdened by heavy taxation imposed to pay for her father's Roman subsidies. Cleopatra implemented measures to ease the tax load on small farmers, often the backbone of Egypt's economy, while improving the efficiency of grain collection and storage. Papyrus records show the standardization of grain tithe rates and the establishment of secure granaries, steps that stabilized food supplies and reinforced royal authority. She also reasserted state control over the lucrative caravan routes that linked Egypt to the Arabian trade networks, ensuring that customs revenues flowed into the royal treasury. These policies not only bolstered Egypt's fiscal health, but also demonstrated Cleopatra's willingness to engage with the practicalities of governance rather than entrust them entirely to bureaucrats. Maintaining Egyptian identity under the veneer of Greek rule was another of Cleopatra's achievements. Although her family was Macedonian, she embraced Egyptian religious forms, appearing publicly as the reincarnation of Isis, commissioning reliefs that depicted her in the iconography of native goddesses, and holding festivals that integrated Greek and Egyptian mythologies. By doing so, she reinforced a sense of unity among Egypt's diverse populations, elevating shared rituals above ethnic divisions. Temples in Upper Egypt received gifts inscribed with bilingual texts, indicating her desire to speak to both Greek-speaking elites and native Egyptian priests. Such gestures underscored her vision of a multicultural kingdom, one that could navigate the complexities of Hellenistic and Egyptian traditions and withstand the pressures of external powers. At the heart of Cleopatra's long-term vision was the idea of an independent, cosmopolitan Egypt that could serve as a crossroads between continents. She cultivated alliances with neighboring kingdoms, exchanged ambassadors and envoys with Parthia and Nubia, and entertained the notion of a Hellenistic Eastern Federation buoyed by Egypt's wealth and naval strength. While her ambitions ultimately faltered in the face of Rome's inexorable rise, they reveal a strategic outlook that extended well beyond the confines of her own dynasty. Cleopatra imagined Egypt not as a backwater caught between giants, but as a sovereign power capable of shaping Mediterranean geopolitics. In the centuries since her death, Cleopatra's legacy has been refracted through countless prisms of myth, propaganda, scholarship, and art. Yet beneath the layers of legend and interpretation lies the kernel of a ruler whose intellect, political innovation, and cultural diplomacy forged a unique chapter in Egyptian history. In Hollywood's bright lights or in the silent aisles of a desert temple, her story continues to challenge us to look beyond spectacle toward the substance of her reign. Her tomb may remain undiscovered, and her image may shift with each new portrayal, but the essence of her achievement endures. A queen who navigated empire with vision, who championed knowledge amid conquest, and who strove to keep alive the legacy of Egypt even as the world around her changed forever. Debates about Cleopatra's place in history often turn on a central question. Was she a feminist pioneer transcending the limitations placed upon women in her time, or merely a pawn manipulated by the ambitions of Rome? Women's history and gender studies have brought new light to her story, reframing her not as a passive object of male desire, but as an active agent navigating an overwhelmingly male political landscape. In patriarchal societies, women who wielded power were routinely confronted with double standards, praised for their beauty but condemned for the same attribute when used as a tool of influence, celebrated for strategic alliances yet derided as seductresses. Cleopatra embodied these tensions. When she spoke before the Roman Senate or negotiated with foreign rulers, her intelligence and fluency in multiple languages, Greek, Egyptian, Latin, perhaps even Hebrew and Aramaic, set her apart. Yet Roman propagandists reduced her to a caricature of excess, the Eastern witch who ensnared Antony and nearly toppled the Republic. Modern scholars counter this narrative by pointing out that alliance building is intrinsic to statecraft, and Cleopatra's romantic liaisons were intertwined with political necessity. By leveraging personal relationships, she secured military support, stabilized her kingdom's economy, and protected Egypt's autonomy. Feminist historians thus reclaim Cleopatra's agency, arguing that she wielded her femininity as a resource rather than a weakness, a skillful diplomat rather than a dependent consort. They highlight her legal reforms, such as adjusting the grain tax, and her patronage of scholars at Alexandria's libraries, demonstrating her commitment to governance beyond mere royal pageantry. In reassessing Cleopatra through the lens of gender studies, it becomes clear that her story challenges assumptions about women's leadership, forcing a reevaluation of how power, beauty, and authority intersect in the narratives we accept. Cleopatra's resonance did not end with the collapse of her dynasty. Her legacy lived on in African historical thought as well. In sub-Saharan and North African intellectual traditions, she came to symbolize both the zenith of indigenous rule and the frailty of sovereignty under external pressure. African scholars have at times celebrated her as one of the continent's greatest rulers, emphasizing her defense of Egyptian culture against Rome's expansionism. This perspective casts her not as a foreign queen, but as an inheritor of pharaonic lineage, a bridge between Black African civilizations and the Mediterranean world. During the era of Arab nationalism in the 20th century, Cleopatra was reimagined once again. Writers in Egypt and the broader Middle East invoked her name to rally pride in the region's pre-Islamic heritage, portraying her as a symbol of strength and sophistication in defiance of colonial narratives. Books and plays depicted her ruling with wisdom, maintaining Egypt's independence through diplomacy rather than yielding to European dominance. At the same time, her multicultural court, where Greek, Egyptian, Roman, and Middle Eastern cultures mingled, offered a historical precedent for modern aspirations of pan-Arab unity. Cleopatra's image, inscribed on coins and printed in nationalist pamphlets, became an emblem of regional identity, reminding audiences that Egypt's grandeur predated the conquests of European powers. Thus, in African and Middle Eastern contexts, she served both as a touchstone for cultural pride and as a model for modern political movements seeking to reclaim indigenous narratives. Her reach extended far beyond Africa and the Mediterranean. In India and China, Cleopatra's story was embraced in distinctive ways that reflected local attitudes toward power, empire, and femininity. In Sanskrit texts and regional folklore, she was sometimes compared to legendary queens like Draupadi or the Chinese Empress Wu Zetian. Women who, like Cleopatra, defied patriarchal norms and commanded respect through statecraft and diplomatic skill. In early modern China, Jesuit missionaries introduced her tale, along with classical Roman histories, inspiring Chinese literati to ponder the nature of virtue, desire, and imperial ambition. Paintings in Qing-era palaces occasionally depicted her as an exotic sovereign, her garb stylized to match Chinese ideas of royalty rather than authentic Hellenistic dress. In South Asian literature, she appeared in Urdu and Hindi poems as a figure of tragic romance, her plight echoing that of local heroines caught between love and duty. The universal appeal of her narrative, strong female ruler, lover of two powerful men, tragic end, resonated with cultures whose own histories grappled with the costs of ambition and empire. Artistic representations from Africa to East Asia adopted her image. Carvings in Mali, stage dramas in Jakarta, and even contemporary dance performances in Cape Town have drawn on her mythos. Each adaptation filtered Cleopatra through local symbols: dragons in China, lotus motifs in India, geometric patterns in Morocco, creating a kaleidoscope of interpretations that underscore her status as a global icon. In every context, she inspired reflections on leadership, identity, and the interplay between personal agency and geopolitical forces. Today, Cleopatra's story continues to offer lessons for modern leadership and political strategy. Her capacity to engage with multiple cultures, build coalitions, and wield soft power through cultural patronage illustrates the value of diplomacy over mere coercion. In an age defined by globalization and multicultural societies, her vision of a cosmopolitan kingdom that drew strength from diversity remains remarkably relevant. She championed economic reforms that alleviated burdens on ordinary citizens, demonstrating that benevolent governance and public welfare are foundations of lasting authority. Her support for scientific inquiry and the arts underscores how intellectual investment can enhance a nation's prestige and resilience. At the same time, her ultimate failure reminds contemporary audiences that strategic miscalculations, underestimating the resolve of a rival or misreading shifting political alliances, can prove fatal. Cleopatra's alliances with Caesar and Antony, while brilliant in conception, faltered under the might of Rome's unified front. This duality, triumphs tempered by missteps, offers a nuanced case study for leaders today. Ambition must be balanced by realism, and charisma must rest on institutional strength. Beyond practical insights, Cleopatra endures as a symbol of resistance and ambition in a world that often marginalizes powerful women. Her defiance of Rome's patriarchal order resonates with modern movements advocating for gender equity in politics and business. She showed that feminine authority can command armies and shape empires, challenging lingering stereotypes about female passivity. At the same time, her portrayal in history has been shaped by victors who sought to diminish her, an early example of how narratives can be manipulated to serve political ends. Engaging with her story encourages us to question other historical accounts and to seek out silenced perspectives. In this sense, Cleopatra matters less as an ancient curiosity than as a catalyst for critical reflection on how power, gender, and storytelling intersect. Rewriting history to recover Cleopatra's agency involves peeling back layers of propaganda, from Roman orations that vilified her to colonial-era texts that exoticized her. Scholars today employ archaeology, papyrology, and comparative analysis to reconstruct her policies, her cultural initiatives, and her everyday governance. This process underscores the importance of interdisciplinary approaches. Combining textual evidence with material culture reveals the texture of her reign more fully than either source alone. Recognizing Cleopatra as both a product of her world and a shaper of it invites us to revisit other historical figures whose legacies have been similarly obscured. It reminds us that myth and memory are not static, they evolve with each generation's values and preoccupations. Ultimately, Cleopatra's enduring fascination lies in her embodiment of contradictions. She was both ruler and subject, woman and sovereign, lover and strategist. Her life story traverses themes of power, beauty, cultural synthesis, and the politics of memory. As a final reflection on her significance, we might consider how her narrative compels us to interrogate our own assumptions about leadership and gender. She teaches that authority is crafted as much through narrative and symbolism as through armies and treaties, that identity can be both personal and political, and that the most compelling leaders are those who understand, and at times manipulate, the stories that people tell about them. Accordingly, engaging with Cleopatra today is not merely an exercise in ancient history, but a means of exploring the enduring dynamics of truth, myth, and power in human societies.